Yeah, okay, thank you. Hi. Hello, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us for the latest NFM webinar. It's the latest in a series in which we're aiming to help researchers and practitioners share knowledge and experience in natural flood management. Today, we're really pleased we've got Dr. Tom Nisbet from Forest Research, and he's working on the Landwise project, and he's going to talk to us about woodlands and natural flood management. Hi, I'm Gerard Stewart, and I'm the communications coordinator for the Natural Flood Risk Management Programme. Just before we start, a couple of housekeeping issues. Microsoft seemed to have changed. There we go. Is it going to change? Good. All right. Yeah. A couple of housekeeping issues. Please keep your microphones muted, and I suggest probably videos off to avoid distracting others during the presentation. Please do ask questions. Use the chat function to do that. And also respond to comments, questions that others have made. We've had some lively discussions in previous webinars. I need to let you know the webinar is being recorded, and we will make it available on our website in the next couple of days. So please do let colleagues know who weren't able to make it, or you can watch it again. Just before I hand over to Tom, I just want to give you a bit of background to the research programme. It's a NERC-funded 4-year, £4 million research programme, and we're carrying out novel science to improve understanding of natural flood management where possible, including quantification. We're looking at a range of NFM scenarios and measures in different types of catchments and different flooding scenarios and at different scales. And we aim to improve evidence and understanding for policymakers and practitioners. There are 3 research projects that make up the programme. As I mentioned, Tom is working on the Landwise project, and you can find out more about the other projects on our website, and indeed they have their own websites, which you can link through to from the programme website. A really important part of the programme is working with partners and engaging them with the work that we're doing. And really this webinar programme is part of that. So yes, we've got a large number of partners, and that probably isn't representative of all of them, but gives you a flavour of who's involved. So, without further ado, I'll hand over to Tom.
Thanks, Gerard. I'll try and share my screen now. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to speak to you today on the topic of woodlands and natural flood management. I'm Tom Nisbet, work for Forest Research, but this presentation is very much a team effort, drawing on the work of colleagues Hugh Thomas and Samantha Broadmeadow in particular. So what I intend to do is just go through the processes whereby woodland can influence natural flood management, cover the evidence base, and then describe how we're using that information to inform policy and practice. So I thought we'd start with just going through the various mechanisms whereby we have a good level of understanding of how woodlands can affect different elements of flood generation and conveyance. The first of those is a well-known one. It's the link to the ability of forests to evaporate more water than shorter vegetation, often referred to as interception loss. top right picture is sort of, you might be able to see sort of steam rising from the canopy, and this is the direct evaporation of rainwater from the canopy, which happens both during and after rainfall. The second mechanism, another well-known one, it's the ability of trees to improve the soil, protect the soil, and through doing, creating what we call macroporosity, pores, channels whereby rainwater can quickly infiltrate into the soil rather than run off the surface. And there's a picture there showing a sort of tree root system indicating how this macroporosity is formed. The third way, also fairly well known, it's more spatially explicit. It relates to the benefits of trees in the riparian zone and floodplain to interact with flood flows, both in channel and out of bank, through what we refer to as hydraulic roughness, surface roughness. It's just the barrier effect, friction created by flows passing around through, over, between trees, shrubs, dead wood, surface roots, etc. And then the last mechanism, an indirect one, we know as a result of trees being able to protect the soil, that provided those trees, woodlands and forests are well managed, that that will reduce sediment loss to waters. And of course, the more we can reduce sediment delivery, the less downstream siltation, and that helps to increase conveyance of floodwaters passing through towns and cities. So those are the four main processes involved. I'm now going to just work through, take each of those in turn, and just describe where we are with level of understanding and evidence of the respective importance. So starting with interception, I mentioned this is well known. Lots of work been done on this over the years, decades, linked to previously issues over the extent to which this interception loss can affect runoff, which obviously has a potential impact on water resources, but also extreme flows. And this plot shows a wide range of studies from around the world, quite a few of them, showing how interception loss as a percentage of precipitation up the y-axis from 0 to 0.6 or 0 to 60% changes as the volume of annual rainfall changes. So if you go from drier to wetter parts of the world. And what you can see here is two lines, a blue line for conifer. These are all direct measurements. You just measure the amount of rainfall coming into the forest above or outside the forest, and then compare that with what's measured underneath the forest canopy, and that difference is this interception loss, and that's what's plotted here. And so the blue line and the blue is the best fit for the blue pluses, which is each individual study measured value. And then the black triangles is the data for broadleaf woodland, with the best fit line again shown in black. And what you can see here is that across, while the amount of interception loss on an annual basis changes with rainfall, annual rainfall, there's a pretty consistent, significant volume of water lost by interception, which ranges by about 30 to 45% for conifers and sort of 17-23% for broadleaves. So in the face of it, quite a significant reduction in volume. But this is on an annual basis, and what we are most concerned about is during flood events, and of course the periods of much heavier rainfall, perhaps more intense rainfall, the opportunity for this interception loss could potentially decrease. So as a result of that, maybe 10-15 years ago, when the interest in flooding and land use, natural flood management was evolving, and the late Ian Calder did some modelling work looking at how looking at the physics of interception, looking at how this interception loss would change on a daily basis with linked to daily rainfall. And what this plot shows is model output. On the y-axis is daily interception, and that's in millimeters, versus across the x-axis increasing volume of daily rainfall. And what you can see here is that the three lines, the blue one is for conifer, and what that shows is that the volume of rainfall increases in a day. The interception loss does increase, as one might expect, but then reaches a plateau by about 30 millimeters of rainfall, suggesting that, yeah, for a significant sort of flood event, 25 millimeters an inch, you could possibly see a reduction of 7 millimeters. But as the storm events increase in size, as you might expect for larger and larger floods, so 50, 100, 150, 200 millimeters plus a day, then that loss doesn't increase any further, and so it's limited. It's even more limited if you look at the other two lines. There's a sort of brown stroke dark green line and a red one below it. Those are for broadleaf, and the brown line is for summer, and the red one for winter, indicating not a lot of difference between the two seasons, but suggesting we can only maybe lose about 2 millimeters per day. So those losses are significant, but small, relatively small, certainly as the size of a daily rainfall storm event increases, and yes, one that results in very large floods of maybe 200 or plus more millimeters, then that's becoming quite a small percentage. So having said that, yeah, for each 1 millimeter of evaporation loss, that effectively represents 10 cubic meters per hectare. So for conifers, for conifer cover, you're potentially looking at, yeah, a loss of 70 cubic meters of water per hectare, which is not insignificant. And for a 70 millimeter storm, that represents 10% reduction. So it's still significant, but obviously decreases in significance the bigger the storm and the bigger the flood is. So that was the situation until relatively recently, when we've had new evidence come to the fore, or more a collation of unpublished evidence. And in particular, the work done by Lancaster University and Trevor Page, I'm sure some of you'll be aware of, on the QNFM project, pulled together a lot of unpublished data, or managing to find data from, this is observed data from studies, as they're comparing, measuring the amount of rainfall below a forest canopy compared to above or outside, on a daily basis. And it was surprising just how much data actually is out there in the grey literature. And the plot, the first graph on the left of the slide here, is reproduced from Trevor's publication in hydrology processes, and it shows up the y-axis, again, this interception loss in percentage terms. This is referred to here as evaporation from wet canopies as a percentage of PG, which is just total gross precipitation. But it's essentially the same thing. It's a percentage reduction, a percentage loss of water through evaporation, versus along the x-axis and storm rainfall, not daily rainfall necessarily in this plot, storm rainfall, which could potentially extend over more than one day. But what this shows, two sets of dots, black and red. Black is conifer and red is broadleaf. And what you can see here, that even going above 100 storms of 100 millimeters or more, this interception loss appears to become constant, which is very much against what the modelling was, Ian Calder's modelling had suggested. So that with conifers, for instance, you could be looking at between 10 and 30%, even perhaps up to a storm of 400 millimeters, you could be looking at 40 millimeters plus of evaporation loss, which is starting to change the discussion about, the potential for this mechanism to actually continue for large floods. The other two plots in this graphs in this slide, this stimulated us to look in forest research at what data we have. And the top right is a plot for from Coalburn in the north of England. I'll be coming back to that study later, showing, unfortunately, it's not daily or storm rainfall, it's period rainfall, interception versus interception loss for sort of 2 weeks or even a month. And what you can see, similar to Trevor's data, that even with high rainfall periods, albeit extending over weeks rather than days, that percentage interception loss, again, is significant. And then the bottom right is a plot based on an unpublished study by colleagues in forest research for an oak site in actually Alice Holt down in Farnham in Surrey. Again, comparing interception loss versus, in this case, this is daily data versus daily rainfall. And as you can see, even for well, both foliated and non-foliated periods, we can see sort of 10 to 20% reduction in rainfall, net rainfall, as a result of broadleaf interception. So this is obviously very significant and potentially represents a marked reduction in flood, in contribution to flood runoff due to forest interception loss happening during flood events. Of course, it's not just during flood events that this interception loss operates over. Interception happens each time it rains, and in fact, some of the largest reductions occur with light storms. And so as you progress during a year, this interception loss over consecutive rainfall periods effectively leads to less rainfall entering the soil, the forest soil, and that leads to drier soil conditions compared to other land covers. And what this plot shows is work from a predecessor of DEFRA, DTR study called Tadpole. It was conducted, Trees and Drought in Lowland England. It was conducted, led by Newcastle and Loughborough universities and ourselves, at Clipstone Forest in the East Midlands, looking at, we were measuring using neutron probe, how the water content in the soil to depth of 2 meters, that's up the y-axis, changes seasonally, and changes or differs between different land covers. We were measuring soil water content changes under grass, heather, grass in green, heather in pink, oak in orange, and pine in 3 colours, blue, red, and black, because there was felling and then restock, and then a revised plot. And what you can see here is the progression of that soil water content changing during years along the x-axis during the 4-year duration of the study. And yeah, well, you can see some obvious differences in the lower the line, the drier the soil, and the black line just refers to what's called field capacity, the point at which you can generate runoff or drainage to depth. But the main point I want to draw on here is the difference between the green line, the grass, and the orange line for oak, particularly during summer periods. That's where it's dipping down, where you can see a difference of 30, 40 millimeters effectively in terms of soil water content. And then again, the difference with the black line or the blue line, where it's slightly greater, another maybe 10 or 20 millimeter difference, which carries on throughout more of the year rather than the broadleaf. This soil water reduction holds on for a longer period under conifer because of the higher interception loss. And I haven't got time to go into some of the other aspects of this diagram, but we also looked at the impact of felling. That's the red line, and you can see it's how it brings it back towards the grass line. So this is pretty robust data, which shows that in addition to this storm day or storm duration interception loss, during the year, there is this interception loss is represented additionally by drier soil conditions, and that could add tens, 30, 40, depending where you are in the country, of additional potential storage within the soil until that's used up, greater than grass. So this certainly is a very significant mechanism with potential to markedly reduce flood runoff. That's all I want to say on the interception mechanism. I would also now like to turn to the second mechanism, which is soil infiltration. This is, as I say, fairly straightforward one to do with the, I mentioned the macro porosity, the more open structure of woodland soils, reflecting the higher organic content. And yeah, there's been quite a few studies comparing infiltration rates beneath grass versus woodland. Top right is the well-known study at Pontbrenne by Imperial College and CEH and others, showing this marked difference, 60 times higher infiltration rates under in planted woodland shelter belts compared to adjacent grazed pasture. And that is reflected in significant reduction, 78% surface runoff. Pictures there show, yeah, this action of particular livestock surface poaching really compacts that surface turf and reduces the ability of rainfall to enter the soil, resulting in rapid runoff, in contrast to the rooting macroporosity of woodland soils. And a more recent study by Chandler showing the difference again in this infiltration rate between, in this case, sycamore and Scots pine, that's SYC and SP, plots against pasture, that's the far left, and then sycamore and Scots pine under a graze regime, so more agroforestry regime, showing that while these benefits of woodland for increasing infiltration rates are marked, putting animals, livestock into that woodland under an agroforestry type regime can result in significant reduction of that benefit and bringing it more into line with pasture itself. So we need to be careful in terms of how we manage those soils, but certainly very strong evidence of, well known in many studies, of higher infiltration rates under woodland. Next mechanism, hydraulic roughness, surface roughness, well founded in engineering terms. Often referred
it's fine. I'm listening.
Often referred to as Manning-Xen work, some way back now by Chow, 1959.
Hello, somebody's got their, sorry to interrupt, somebody's got their mic on. Can you turn it off, please?
Thank you. Work done coming up with Manning-Xen as a measure of hydraulic roughness. There's a table here published back in 1959 showing how Manning-Xen changes with land cover. And as you go down that table from short grass to dense willows at the bottom, you can see that Manning-Xen increases by at least a factor of 5 and more. And there's quite a range of values there. Fairly straightforward. It reflects, the pictures show, reflects this roughness created by the trees themselves, the dead wood that collects, that can build up into debris dams. And yes, work done by Catherine Wilson's team at Cardiff University showing that this is a significant factor, and in fact can go even above some of these values in that table. And yes, if you translate that across to the effect of woodland in the floodplain, that can be, depending on how much and where you're at and gradient, etc., that can equate to a few hundred cubic meters of additional potential water storage to potentially hundreds of thousands of cubic meters, depending on scale, etc. So again, another significant way whereby, particularly for the floodplain, whereby trees can reduce flood runoff. The last mechanism, sediment delivery, present here. Yeah, it's quite old data from Collins and Walling study done comparing sediment contribution from different land covers. You can see in that plot much lower from woodland, well-managed woodland compared to pasture arable. And yes, that's very much in line with our understanding of how trees provide physical shelter of the soil, reducing rapid runoff and thus entrainment of sediment, and improving strength and stability of bank size, etc. And obviously, as the picture shows, that would reduce the amount of siltation and the need for dredging and improving conveyance. So it's perhaps surprising then that, given what I think is a very strong evidence base founded in the science, the physics of understanding of these mechanisms, that when we turn to the evidence base of catchment data, naturally a desire by all to look at, well, how does all this translate into reductions in flood flows at the catchment scale, as one might expect to see from that evidence. But when we look at that evidence, it's a bit of a mixed bag and a less conclusive bag of evidence. This evidence was reviewed back in 2017 by CEH in a systematic review shown here on the left, and some data in the middle there in the red bar chart, showing that yes, there indeed was evidence of an effect of these of woodland on reducing flood runoff for small floods, but there was some mixed evidence. There was certainly studies that didn't show any effect, and some studies had the opposite effect. But nevertheless, overall, on balance, the evidence showed fairly conclusively that there is an effect in small flood peaks, small floods. But when we looked at the larger floods, particularly the observational studies, measured data, it was difficult to say. You know, there was no clear influence on flood peaks, which, as I say, is somewhat surprising given what we see as the strength of the process data. And that's very much in line with some of the other evidence on natural flood management, that strong at the hill slope, small catchment scale, but the evidence seems to break down with the more larger floods. So it obviously poses a question why. And certainly when we think about woodland and the nature of the evidence, there are quite a few reasons and variables that we can look to that could be can help to explain the lack of evidence, particularly with these larger floods. First of all, the challenge of detecting impacts in relatively rare events. You know, if you're looking at effect on a large flood, one that occurs less, rare than every 10 years or so, you've got a challenge with measuring the change in by way of a long-term studies, properly controlled before and after. And then these larger floods often exceed the measuring structures that we have in place to try and measure the effects on flood flows, because there are rare, large events. And once, of course, they come out of bank, all your the robustness of these measurements break down. So it's perhaps not surprising that there's not a lot of data out there. Very much linked to that is the fact that we don't have many studies. There are very few out there, and this is largely as a result, particularly from a woodland perspective, the long time scale that it needs to run these projects, especially if you want to do a real proper study of comparing before and after you plant trees. These trees have got to grow, the canopy's got to develop and develop these effects, and that takes decades. And so it's a struggle to get an investment to measure those changes. And then against that, while this is going on, there's background changes happening. We all know about how the climate's changing, and it's difficult to control for that. And that all lends itself to where the few studies we do have, they're focused on small catchments, and that then adds to the evidence for the small catchments, but we still lack it for the medium and large catchments. So there are clear scale and location issues linked to that. And then, of course, there are complicating factors in terms of these studies. It matters how you manage the land beforehand in terms of what the land cover is and how it's managed will have an influence on how significant the change will be when you plant trees. And that's something else that's difficult to control for and look at. And then, of course, the way we design the forest and manage it, particularly tight, is it conifers, it's broadleaf, its age, structure, etc. These are all strong influencing factors, and it's almost impossible to build these into these very expensive and long-term studies. And then, yes, lastly, woodland management factors will clearly have a part to play in terms of the results. So it's perhaps not surprising, and I think it remains might be an intractable challenge of actually measuring changes, be it for natural flood management or woodland effects on extreme flows, the very large flows. When we, however, look to the evidence, there is quite a bit out there. It is best, obviously, for the small flows, smaller peak flows, smaller floods, but we do have a lot of data, particularly for the reverse of putting woodland in catchments, looking at effects on flood flows, and that's felling the forest. Something that's much easier to do and quicker to do and helps to overcome some of these issues, but it's still challenging in terms of the bigger events, because you fell a forest and then the norm is to replant it, and if you don't replant it, it'll tend to naturally regenerate. So some people try and study this by applying herbicides to stop regeneration, but you can only keep that going for a few years. And so it's a real challenge again. Even when we can do this easier, you can't extend it over longer time periods, and so it remains a challenge to look at the effect of larger floods. But this was shown here is probably the best evidence we have from before and after controlled comparison studies, 50 odd from around temperate regions of the world, that were reviewed by Guillemette back in 2005, showing how the effect of felling changes with proportion of catchment felled along the x-axis versus the change in peak flow height up the y-axis. And while there is a lot of scatter, which can be explained by a lot of these other factors that come into play, particularly the type of woodland and how it's managed, and climate. You see a definite relationship here. By the time forest cover increases above 20–30%, we have this increase in peak flow. And some of these 100%, there's a lot of spread at the 100% level. Some of those are for quite large floods. There's 3 in there that cover between 50 and 100-year return interval floods, which show values between 30 and 50% increase in peak flow. So we do have some data, but the majority of the data here is for small floods. But I think you would say uniformly shows a significant relationship, and I think it's not really a stretch to turn that in its head and say, well, if we plant trees rather than fell them, we can expect these significant reductions in peak flows to result. Probably I've already mentioned, probably the best study we have in this country is at Coalburn. It is a long-term study. It was set up in 1967 when this 150-hectare catchment was under moorland, rough pasture. Black and white image in top right, an aerial photo of the time in 73, just when it was planted. 5 years of data measurements collected before planting, and then 90% of the catchment planted was largely Sitka spruce, and that's continued to date. And so in principle, it's a very good study. Here we've got almost the ideal long-term study, before and after comparison, not a control catchment, but before and after, and carried forward through time to look at effects. And the data shown here is a plot from Stephen Birkinshaw at Newcastle, looking at the data to see what it shows by way of the effect of that forest growth and development over time on discharge, and also here linking that to return period. Well, that data shows that there is evidence of a reduction. It's been a challenge to unpick this from the study because the lack of the control catchment meant that it was more difficult to unpack the effect of changing weather, and we know that rainfall has changed over this period, and that was part of the study that Steve did. And when you incorporate that change in rainfall over time, we can see a definite difference, not a huge difference, maybe 10 to 20% change in floods, in decrease in flood peaks over time, and diminishing with increasing peak flow towards the 100-year return interval. So there is, you know, this is one of our best studies, and it does back up the evidence, provide evidence that there is an impact on certainly medium floods, but tailing off higher floods, depending how you define that. But of course, we've got to bear this in mind in terms of the nature of the catchment and when it was established. This was forest that was planted in 1972-3. It involved very deep ploughing to 90 centimetre depth every 4.5 metres. And it was slow to establish, and so there's quite a lot of factors in there that could be acting, and we know is acting to sort of reduce the benefit of this forest growth effect. And of course, we now no longer conduct these sort of practices, so we could expect this effect to be larger, but with modern day practices. But it just highlight the difficulties with these long-term studies and dealing with the various changes over time. So I just wanted to say something. I've mainly concentrated on the evidence with regard to woodland itself and the round, but another aspect of woodland and flooding is the use of leaky woody structures, leaky woody dams, known as a variety of things, and there is accumulating evidence that these also can, as an element of woodland, can make a contribution to reducing flood flows and flood risk, most notably at Pickering. The two images, overhead sort of maps on the left, is from Pickering and an assessment of last flood or near flood in 2015, the back end of Storm Desmond, showing above what the extent of flooding during the event, with a range of measures in place, including 160 odd woody debris dams in the catchment, versus below it what was predicted if the measures had not been put in place. Obviously, there was more than just the large woody debris dams. There was a large flood storage scheme, but when we separated that, tried to separate that out, about half of the reduction in flooding, predicted flooding, the light blue extent shows the greater flooding that was predicted had these measures not been in place. There was an impact on a number of properties in the town which weren't flooded in the end during the actual event. And if we look at the when we try to unpick that, we reckon that about half of the difference, about 10% of the 20% reduction that we think happened as a result of these measures was down to the woodland measures. So there's some evidence there, but we need more. But again, it's not easy to measure the effects. We can observe the effects. Top right is a picture showing how these woody debris structures act in flood flows, pushing the water out in bank. We know we can measure, we can see they create additional flood storage, but of course that's different from measuring the effect on an actual flood peak event, certainly down a catchment, and that's work we're still underway to try, and we're waiting for a bigger event to see if we can measure what the actual impact has been. And then of course we just have to be mindful that there are issues over the use of these structures, particularly if they're washed out. That very much can cause issues of blockage of structures downstream, hence the need to try and secure these structures if you're in these more risk-prone sites. And yeah, there was guidance put out by adepts, I think it was last year, the year before, on managing that risk, and that's a reference bottom right to that guidance. Well, as a result of that evidence, but difficulty of measuring effects on large floods in particular. Attention is naturally turned to modelling as a better way to extrapolate some of that evidence and look for interactions with these larger events. There have been quite a number of modelling studies done. The strength of these models is that they can draw on that process understanding and look at how that will impact on the generation and conveyance of flows. And I've referenced here a number of floods modelling studies, Pickering and the New Forest and at Pont Bren. Some of those looking at quite extreme events. At Pickering, it was a 100-year event. At Pont Bren, looked at, I think it was a 180-year event. So the models do indicate that based on these processes, there is a way that they can impact on these larger floods. But yes, there's a range of values, and that very much relates to the various controlling variables that have a part to play. But having said that, certainly fully aware that there are many issues with models. Some of them quite a few of them are lumping a lot of these processes together. Others are selective, they're only looking at one or two processes. Not many of them look at this interception loss of woodland. And then there are questions over how these processes are represented in the models themselves. And of course, the big issue is with the models is we don't really have validation, because we don't have the hard observed data about the impacts on large floods. You can't really validate these models. So models certainly have an important role to play, but you need to be careful in their use and particularly take note of what processes are being incorporated and what values are being selected to represent those. Having said all that, we think the evidence is strong enough to advocate a change in policy and practice and use it to inform those changes. And top right, there's two further reviews post the systematic review by CEH, the Working with Natural Processes Evidence Directory and Underpinning Literature Review from 2018. And then this year, a revision of that evidence as part of the ERAMP review for Welsh Government, which, it's further draws that evidence together and points to a good basis for woodland being able to reduce a flood runoff, at least for the small events, probably for the medium events, and possibly for larger events. And based on that strength of evidence, we've moved forward over the last 5-7 years to think about, well, how can we go about delivering woodlands for reducing flood risk? And that's led us to target communities and assets at risk. There's no necessarily point planting, or if we want to reduce flood risk, that these are the areas we need to target. We've used opportunity mapping, working with the Environment Agency and others. There's various ways of targeting these communities, and the Environment Agency is doing a lot of work on that side of things. Yes, we think the focus should be on prioritising these catchments and probably prioritising the smaller catchments, less than 100 square kilometres, where there's most scope to make a difference over a reasonable time period. Bottom right shows some work we did in Cumbria, where you can apply mapping to identify where the greatest need is and help to target those. But of course, this is all only going to happen over time. It's very important that we join up strategies and plans to make that happen, both flood plans and forest plans. And it's only by doing so that we can make that difference over probably decades of time. And then, of course, all that needs to be backed up with grants and payments to underpin and encourage landowners to plant woodland where it's most needed. And that's been represented. That's represented in this slide. This shows how we've used this targeting approach on the left there to inform countryside stewardship, the Rural Development Programme funding for forest planting, and targeting the flood zone. That's to build on drawn this hydraulic roughness mechanism, in particular extending that to riparian zones, targeting the catchment soils at high propensity to generate rapid runoff. That's the sort of browny, yellowy, orangey area in the map, where the reduction in the interception loss will be particularly effective. And then underpinning that with forest planting grant support. This is general grant support to encourage planting. And then under countryside stewardship, there's additional support, drawing on our evidence and work on the role of woody debris dams, £460 per small dam funding and 760 for large dams, and guidance on the way these should be structured and managed to minimise the risk and be most effective, shown in bottom right. Having said that, it's also important that we take care with how we manage our forests and design them. If based on this strong evidence that woodland creation has a significant role to play, we also have to be mindful of how we manage and redesign our existing woodlands. And that's all linked to the UK Forestry Standard, and the need to think about, or the need to phase felling in particular, probably the practice that is most potentially challenging in terms of temporarily reversing the forest benefit, as I showed from that evidence. So we're developing there's going to be a new practice guide which will draw together information about how to manage phase felling, particularly probably avoid large-scale felling in these higher risk catchments, and then minimising the fallow period to limit that. And then we need to consider about how we redesign the forests and in terms of trying to maintain that forest benefit. And then there's quite a bit we can also do in forest practice in terms of disconnecting drains and restoring riparian zones and wetlands. Second but last, this has then led to with the growing interest and informing policy and practice, interest in valuing the flood service of woodland, and I point here to 3 studies, a national one, GB one, where we had a go at estimating the value of this flood service, and then 2 more focused one's at South Southwell in Nottinghamshire by JBA, and one as part of the Pickering project, which gave values, we think are underestimates, so values in the range of £89 to £250 per hectare per year, which is not insignificant. And obviously when you add that to the other co-benefits of woodland, potentially very, very important. So I've gone over a bit longer than I meant to, but just drawing conclusions, I would say that there's high confidence that woodlands can affect flood runoff based on the sound process understanding. That's represented in, I would say, strong observations, hard evidence that felling can increase peak flows and new planting decrease them in small catchments, less than 10 square kilometre. And that evidence is strongest for the small flood peaks, more frequent than the 10% probability of occurring in any one year. There's a strong logic chain and model-based evidence to say, to give us medium confidence that these effects extend to medium catchments in the range of 10 to 100 square kilometres, and medium flood peaks probably up to the 1% probability. But when we turn to large floods, logic implies that the woodland effects should extend to large floods and large catchments, but there's very little evidence, and there's low confidence, particularly in trying to achieve that sort of scale of woodland change at that sort of size of catchment to make a difference over any reasonable time scale. And then finally, obviously it's very difficult to detect changes to flood peaks, and from the evidence points to the fact that we certainly need a reasonable level of change before we can expect to see any marked difference. So we're probably looking at 15 to 20% change in woodland area before we can expect any significant effect on flood peaks. So this just brings it back to the importance of thinking about long-term planning and strategies to deliver that if we want woodland to contribute to future flood management. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tom. Very interesting. We've had a lot of questions come through. Perhaps if I start off with a very popular topic, which is beavers, and there was a question. There's a question sent in before the webinar, and which was, there is a surge in interest in the role of beavers in NFM. Please can you help us understand whether beavers are magicians or just one species amongst hundreds involved related to NFM? Also, how long might it take compacted soils to recover so that lowland farming soils play a positive role in NFM? Okay, the second one's a bit different, but perhaps focus on the beavers one.
Okay, thanks. Very good question. Unfortunately, Jared, I wasn't able to. My screen doesn't show the chat, so I wasn't able to follow that. But
okay, yeah, this is one that was sent in beforehand. But
yeah,
no,
that's fine. I just thought I'd make that point. If anyone's wondering why we've not been responding to necessarily to the chat. Yeah, in terms of beaver, obviously growing interest in beavers. Natural engineer, catchment engineer, doing a lot of what we would like seeing happen with regard to this drawing on this hydraulic roughness mechanism I mentioned as a result of this dead wood and woody debris structures and such like. So certainly you can see a direct relation to how you would expect beavers to help to reduce flood flows. And I think the evidence that's being drawn together is supportive of that. Yeah, you need to unpack the evidence in terms of it varies across the board, in terms of which mechanism is acting here as best. Certainly, beaver dams tend to be, more solid. The beavers will quickly try and seal them because they don't want a lot of leakage. So a lot of the space, potential water storage is being held, used up over much of the time. So potentially not so much additional freeboard that can come into play. But having said that, certainly scope for that water to be pushed further out of bank to the sides of the floodplain during a flood event, creating additional storage. But probably the biggest role is obviously in terms of a timing, that these dams are going to, through creating that additional pooling and ponding of water, are going to be effective at reducing the speed of runoff down these systems, and also potentially, depending on when these floods occur, yes, water levels could draw down a bit more and create more flood storage during drier summer periods, and there could be more water draining into the groundwater and creating some storage that way. So overall, yes, I think the evidence is positive from beavers having a benefit. Yes, there are some risks in terms of potential washout, but some of that evidence shows, yeah, you need quite a big event before these will wash out. So overall, yes, I would say positive.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, the questions are flooding in. Tom has kindly agreed to answer as many as he can after the webinar in written form. So we'll post Tom's answers to the questions that we don't have time to cover now on our website. Another question that was sent in before was, how do we ensure the right tree in the right place with the right management approach? What role is there for local decision making in a world of opportunity maps? Yeah,
very good question again. Obviously, governments are all supportive and of woodland expansion for a range of benefits. I expect we're all aware of that woodland creation agenda, certainly driven by carbon, but also many other co-benefits, one of which in particular, as I hope I've described, is the scope to reduce flooding. But yes, it very much depends on where that woodland goes. I think there's a real opportunity here to try and realise some of the, given this policy of woodland expansion, to try and target that to where it's most needed to help reduce flood risk, because that's obviously another very pressing issue. The more we can do in that regard, the better. And that's what's led us to think about, working in the environment is about thinking about priority catchments and where to put these trees. But yes, at the end of the day, it very much comes down to the site and what you plant and how you design it. These sort of variables that will influence just what the extent of difference one can make. And yes, it has to be scaled up if it's going to make a meaningful contribution at a catchment level. So these sort of questions about the right tree in the right place, it's a bit of a balancing act. As I've indicated, there's these mechanisms vary. The strength of them varies between the type of trees and how you manage it. So issues of conifer versus broadleaf and clear felling and not, and then there's issues about other related management practices. All will have an influence. So yeah, we do need to be smart in thinking. We need to balance, because while conifers may give us the greatest, certainly, interception loss, they're not suitable for by any means everywhere across the country. And what I think I've showed is that broadleaves also have got a bigger role than what we perhaps previously thought when it comes to interception. So it's very much a balancing approach. That's the way the Forestry Commission is going forward. We've got procedures in place for woodland creation application process and consideration of potential EIA, for all these factors to be considered to make sure that we do achieve that right balance and the right tree is planted in the right place. And that's particularly, I touched briefly on some of the disbenefits. One of the flip side of the flood benefit is the potential reduction in water resources. Because yes, if we're losing this water, while it's beneficial during flood events, it's potentially, certainly with groundwaters, potentially you're losing some resource, and given these days of perhaps worsening droughts in the future, that this is also a consideration. So yeah, we're very much mindful of the potential disbenefits, including the washing out of debris dams, etc., and that's very much factored into that assessment process. And yeah, the key point to make is, it's not just, there's a lot to unpack when you consider woodland for water. We can manage a lot of these issues by the type of tree, the design of it, so that we should be able to get the greatest benefit for the least disbenefit or risk.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot there. A question from from Jenny Knight from Environmental Resources Wales, and she's asked, what are the current most interesting monitoring observational experiments in brackets going on in regards catchment change, given the focus on new woodland implementation?
Yeah, as I pointed to, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of studies underway. For a time, on the back of the Working with Natural Processes project, we were hoping that we might see some catchment laboratory established to generate this long-term data. That's not really happened. We've got a few long-term forest type studies, particularly one at Coalburn. There are data from Plinlimmon and Balquhidder, but they're not specifically necessarily designed, albeit they're generating useful data. And obviously they were a time when these woodlands were planted in older style practice. But yes, we can draw on those, but that's a small number. You can count on one hand. We do have continuing monitoring, like at Pickering, and we've got in Forest Research, we've got some studies in Wales. Previously, we monitored assess effects of woody debris dams at Great Trilly Woods near Agaveni. We're now working with Natural Resources Wales at the Pennell Catchment in North Wales. So there are measurements, but it's a real challenge to get the investment to continue these measurements over time to get that robust data, because as I say, we're all interested in measuring the effects on relatively large floods, because we think we've got very good data on the small floods. But if we're defining small floods as those that are occurring less than occur more frequently than one in every 10 years. So by definition, the evidence we're wanting to try and improve on is events that occur rarer than every 10 years. Well, if you want to measure a change, be it planting trees, felling trees, building large woody debris dams on events that only occur less than once every 10 years, you need a baseline period to characterize that response, and then you need to make a change, and then you need at least another 10 years, probably longer, to quantify the change. So it is very challenging. We need more studies. We've got a few we can draw on, but yeah, we're still very limited.
Thanks, Tom. I'm really sorry, but we've run out of time now. So I'll just quickly close. First of all, just thanks very much to Tom for a very interesting presentation and thorough answers to the questions posed. There's a lot of questions we didn't have time to get to. We'll try and get you answers those in written form on our website. If you do have any follow-up questions or feedback, please email us. There's the research program and Tom's email address is there. As I said, the recording will be available on the website. The next webinar on the 3rd of December is Dr. Nick Chappell from the University of Lancaster, and he'll be talking about the QNFM project, so another project within the research program, and he's going to be talking about measuring NFM effectiveness. Please do sign up to our newsletter if you'd like to keep in touch, and if you do that, we'll keep you posted on upcoming webinars. So that the newsletter is about 3 times a year. One coming out this month actually. So just remains to once again thank Tom and all of you for joining, and hopefully we'll see you at the next webinar. Thanks very much, and goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.